the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you're answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
Actually, sending us some chat messages. Yes, we are all excited to hear the speaker today, Mario. Stay tuned, you'll get a chance to talk to Sharon after the seminar is over. So it's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sharon Udasin. Okay, so we have to probably turn down. There is some feedback somewhere. Anyways, so well, Sharon is an environmental reporter and a co-author of the book Poisoning the Well: How Forever Chemicals Contaminated America. Sharon was first introduced to the forever chemicals, or PFAS, problem by colleagues in 2019 as a Ted Scripps Fellow in Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado Boulder. Since completing the fellowship, she has covered U.S. West climate issues for The Hill. So she got her start as an environmental journalist during her many years covering the subject at the Jerusalem Post in Israel. So a graduate of both the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia Journalism School, Sharon received a SEAL Environmental Journalism Award in 2023. Congratulations. So today, Sharon is going to talk about the PFAS problem that she highlights in her book. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And that was a really lovely introduction. So I guess I don't have to introduce myself at all, but I will add that I'm actually originally from New Jersey. So at the end of this presentation, I'm going to get a tiny bit into some details about New Jersey's PFAS problem, even though it's not really covered at all in the book. Anyway, I will begin if my slides allow me. There we go. So when we head to the grocery store, treat ourselves to new clothes, or refill our water bottles, most of us aren't aware of every single ingredient we're about to encounter, even if we are scientists or scientists in training. Instead, we put our trust in companies and governments to keep us safe, in sort of an unwritten pact between supplier and consumer. But today we're going to take a look at some cases in which that trust has been broken, focusing on communities that have weathered some of the most tragic effects of what is now a global contamination crisis. So we'll start with a brief visit to Cortland, Alabama, to encounter one of these communities. There's Cortland. So welcome to Cortland. This is the beautiful downtown, which I had the pleasure of actually visiting in March 2023 it was. When I was there, what I saw was a historic southern town surrounded by sprawling greenery and with gazebos and other things that you just saw in the previous photo. It was home to one of the South's first railroads. And there's nearly 200 years of architecture that ranges from the Victorian era to veranda-wrapped cottages. But what I also saw was a huge amount of death and devastation. Let's now hear from Brenda Hampton, an activist who took me on a ride through Cortland in March 2023. And this is a photo of Brenda, and in this photo, I'm actually sitting in the passenger's seat, and she was giving me the following explanation, approximately during that time.
The father and the mother, the father and the son had died there. The next house the mother died at. The next house coming down the street, husband and wife died. The next house was husband and wife. The next house was a female that died. Young girl died here in this house here. As I serviced this house, the husband died in there. He had renal failure. The wife is still alive in there. The lady that lived in there, she's dead.
Yeah, we actually, my co-author and I, we both had similar rides with Brenda, and we came to call this Brenda's Death Tour. And sorry, that plays twice sometimes. But the thing about Brenda is she's just a regular person who in 2015 was undergoing a routine checkup as part of her McDonald's managerial transfer from Boston to Tennessee. But shockingly, during that physical, her tests showed that she was in renal failure and that she had been exposed to something toxic. And she said to me, like, that what I was working with, it was nothing toxic. It was hamburgers and French fries. And well, some people might think that's toxic. It's not toxic in the way that we are thinking. But she was so startled that instead of going to Tennessee, she decided to move back to her hometown, Cortland, Alabama, to be with her daughters. And there, I just want you to notice this map has the dual cities, or let's call them towns, of Cortland and North Cortland right next to each other. Brenda was really curious, and she quickly observed how sick people were in both of the two Cortlands. And these are towns, you know, of just about a few hundred people each. And she found 54 cases of cancer and 14 of kidney failure in 2 streets alone. Once she realized that something called PFAS were wrecking the towns, Brenda self-funded efforts to distribute supplies and drive her neighbors to their medical appointments. And really all she and her neighbors were doing were trusting the tap, which is something that each of us do every single day. Now, Brenda was shuttling her neighbors, but she herself has hardly been spared. In addition to her kidney failure, she's suffered from 2 heart attacks and a stroke since then. And she and her neighbors again had been drinking water contaminated by compounds known as PFAS, which I assume most of you are familiar with, but I will go through the slide that I used for lay populations just in case. So PFAS. That's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. The acronym for this is arguable, but most scientists will say it's about 15,000 synthetic organofluorines, but I feel like depending on who you ask, you get a different number all the time. They're in lots of household items, such as waterproof fabrics, nonstick pans, and cosmetics, as well as in certain firefighting foams. And we should acknowledge that their water and stain-resistant properties have made them also incredibly useful, critical even, in certain types of medical devices, first responder gear, and in semiconductors. And I always like to acknowledge that probably every single person listening to this conversation, including me, the speaker, probably has something on their bodies that contains PFAS right now. So all of those useful properties sound great, but what's the problem? As I saw in Cortland, downstream from massive industrial discharges, which I will get to later, the effects can really be dire. And that's because PFAS don't break down in the environment at all. They linger in the human body by binding to proteins in the blood of at least 97% of Americans. That's according to the CDC. They're linked to many cancers and kidney, thyroid, heart, reproductive, and immune issues. And you would think that with such potentially risky effects, regulators may have been quick to step in. But the EPA took decades to regulate just a few types of PFAS. And well, we'll get to that later as well, but those are being pulled back as well. So they're just forever and they're everywhere, but they weren't always. And so before we dive into the birth of forever chemicals, I just want to show you a brief outline as to what to expect today, and also emphasize that most of the citations necessary for this presentation are actually in the book itself, unless otherwise noted here. So PFAS, again, were not always here. They were born accidentally, and that occurred in New Jersey, where postdoctoral scholar Roy Plunkett was working on replacements to hazardous refrigerants at a DuPont lab in 1938. That was deep water. For him, again, I apologize for simplifying the science because you guys are mostly scientists, but it's still a good recap. So this meant storing cold cylinders of tetrafluoroethylene, TFE, gas, like in these really, really cold conditions, and he assumed that the gas would stay a gas. But upon opening the cylinders, Roy discovered a white powder. Upon further research, he understood that the TFE had undergone polymerization, in which the carbon-carbon double bond in a TFE breaks apart and attacks others. The resultant powder was heat resistant, and most things didn't stick to it. So DuPont went on to trademark that substance as poly-TFE, PTFE, or Teflon in 1944. Now, Teflon quickly appealed to the US military. It was resistant to heat and corrosion, and it didn't interact with other chemicals. So one of its first uses was to contain highly reactive materials like uranium in the making of the atom bomb. But Teflon only reached consumers thanks to an inventor across the world in Rumilly, France. There, Marc Gregoire, an inventor, started coating his own pans with Teflon and launched the company Tefal in 1956. Tefal then began exporting its products to the US in 1961, and these products were made super popular in no small part thanks to a photograph of Jackie Kennedy purchasing a pan at, I believe, the Macy's in New York City, but I may have gotten the place wrong. But that it just spread like wildfire from there. So just to take us back a bit, let's hear or see actually a clip from an ad from the period, 1960s. Okay.
Ladies, no more scraping, no more grinding, no more pounding, no more scouring, no more problems, no more mess with new Slip Away. You just spray, bake, and slip away. Yes, here in this handy spray can is new Slip Away, the revolutionary new non-stick coating for pots, pans, ovens, and grills. And Slip Away contains the magic of DuPont Teflon. Just spray the surface of your cooking utensils, bake in the oven for 30 minutes, and your Slip Away non-stick surface will literally last for months.
Ladies. So not everything was as shiny as these pans made it out to be. Really, actually, this whole time, there was toxicological research happening behind the scenes. I'll give you some examples. In the 1950s, researchers inside and outside of DuPont found that some people exposed to heated Teflon developed flu-like effects. That was called polymer fume fever at the time. 1959, an FDA official wrote that Teflon might be unstable under cooking temperatures and that some decomposition products are quite toxic. And yet, that same FDA approved Teflon-coated cookware. 1961, a DuPont toxicologist wrote that some PFAS could cause liver enlargement in rats. 1978, another company that was a PFAS producer, 3M, found the compounds in the blood of its employees with fluorine levels proportional to the length of time they worked there and persisting in some for 15 to 20 years. And by 1981, 3M had found something so problematic about one type of PFAS, PFOA, that it decided it needed to alert the EPA, and that was a link to birth defects. The fetuses of rats that had consumed PFOA were developing eye deformities. But the same alert also emphasized that no human health problems have been observed. Nonetheless, 3M started assessing what worker illnesses might mean for its bottom line, and a 1984 memo's concerns were citing things like employee health and corporate liability. So by the year 2000, 3M agreed to start phasing out the two most notorious PFAS, the one I mentioned before, PFOA and PFOS, but it kept producing many of their chemical cousins. And one of the places where 3M and other industries set up shop was in northern Alabama, near the city of Decatur and upstream from Brenda's community, Cortland. So it looks like Cortland is up on the map from 3M, but that's really downstream where you see here. So 3M's Decatur site on the Tennessee River upstream from Brenda Hampton's town opened in 1961. By 1976, 3M found one of the especially notorious PFAS, again, this time PFOS, in a Decatur worker's blood, and then again in several employees in 1979. By the 90s, 3M scientists cited interest in possible health risks to workers regarding liver and bladder cancers, as well as endocrine and reproductive disorders. And possible effects really went beyond the factory bounds. In 1979, PFAS were found in fish that were caught in the river around Wheeler Dam and water utilities downstream from the plant. And I will mention that this photo I took in March 2023. This is Wheeler Dam. There are a couple signs in various places saying do not fish, but most people are just ignoring them. There are so many people fishing out there and feeding those fish to their families. By 2007 to 2010, after one company notified the EPA that it had, quote, unknowingly discharged large amounts of PFAS into the Tennessee River, the EPA, the federal government, finally stepped in and started testing. 2014, the ATSDR started taking community blood samples and found PFOA and PFOS levels that were 2 to 4 times higher than US averages in residents' blood. Now, many plants still line the Tennessee River today, and they are allowed to dump there, even though the EPA lists the area as impaired with PFOS and agricultural materials. And while these discharges are lawful, really thanks to a lack of regulation in Alabama, companies have at times violated their legal bounds, doing things like underreporting PFAS releases and breaching contracts. And Brenda really describes the situation in this quote very well. She says, they are still taking advantage of Alabama. Nobody goes by any rules. Nobody questions anything. Except Brenda herself. She was able to recruit a small cohort of fellow activists as well as scientists to her side. Together, they've pushed through lawsuits, tested water, and exposed injustices in the media. But in doing so, Brenda has made herself an enemy of locals who rely on industry, her neighbors who work at 3M, for example. And she said she was shot at, she had 2 cars destroyed, and she found that someone broke into her truck and left a cut-up Chucky doll. However, her efforts helped secure a settlement between 3M and her water utility. And in 2019, that settlement for $35 million allowed residents to receive small checks, and probably more importantly, the utility was able to build a reverse osmosis treatment plant, meaning that Brenda and her neighbors now get PFAS-free water coming through their taps. And that's the reverse osmosis facility. But this was just the first of multiple settlements between 3M area residents. We saw with Brenda, like how industrial PFAS pollution caused devastation downstream, but it really left a mark on the land itself, like in a city whose history is completely intertwined with the manufacturing sector, and that's Decatur itself. So you see how close those two are. 3M has just been a complete pillar in Decatur and a major employer of residents for so long. And the former city council president, Paige Beebe, said to me, look at Decatur's history, anything and everything we have, if it's to the hospital benefit or anybody, you look on the program, who is the platinum giver? 3M. Now, does any gift really come for free? Well, some people possibly paying the price were teachers and students who attended Brookhaven Middle School from 1971 to 2018. Their school was built atop a landfill that operated in the 1940s through the 1960s. 3M has since admitted to dumping there for about a year during landfill operations. The school district eventually took legal action and settled with 3M, which bought the site for $1.25 million despite its $487,500 value. So they bought it for a lot more and then began demolition. And I'm going to explain who the person right there is in a second, but these again are photos from the demolition site of the middle school that I was able to take on a tour with this man, Pat, in, again, March 2023. And keep in mind, again, that was March 2023. But by November 2023, 3M declared the green space is suitable for public use. Like they had finished their demolition, put some plants over it, and they made this declaration, even though their pre-demolition plan showed significant PFOS levels at test sites. And if you ask the Alabama Department of Environmental Management about this, really they just deferred to 3M. Now, just wanted you to hear from Pat Underwood, who's a graduate of Brookhaven Middle School a long time ago. He's now around 40. He's a martial artist and a former volunteer for Tennessee Riverkeeper, known locally as the Trash Ninja.
It was like a running joke. We all knew that the school was built on a landfill. Like it wasn't a hidden thing. Like we all were in on it. And the joke that we all just subscribed to was that the school was sinking 3 inches or something a year. And that eventually when we were old in our 30s and 40s, like how old that was going to be, you know, like that, which isn't old, that like that the school was just going to sink into the ground. Little did we know that there was some serious industrial contaminants in that landfill.
So the city of Decatur, too, was embroiled in a lawsuit with 3M, and the details of all of these lawsuits are really available in the book, and I won't get into all of them, but by October 2021, Decatur, the county, and the utilities settled with 3M for nearly $100 million, with $35 million going to fund a new rec center in Decatur. Now, former council members like Paige Beebe, who I quoted earlier, maintained that negotiations and the deal were both flawed, in part due to ties between city leadership and industry. Now, you'll notice that $35 million went to fund a rec center. So many environmentalists and other concerned residents were very, very upset by this because instead of funding any type of cleanup, the money went to fund a new building built by real estate moguls who had connections with the city's leadership. And you can read all about that municipal drama if you so choose. One environmental attorney said 3M, I believe then and would believe now, knew that they had most of the leaders of the county in their pocket on their side. And I will also emphasize that we do have reactions from 3M and DuPont across the book, but I didn't list every single one in this presentation. So the experiences of Cortland and Decatur showed us the lasting impacts of PFAS producers on adjacent communities, but industry is not alone. The military has also been part of this journey since day one. So let's go to Colorado to see an example. And we are going to Colorado Springs in El Paso County, which is about 2 hours south of where I am in Boulder. It's really beautiful as well. So Colorado Springs and its El Paso County suburbs are surrounded not only by natural wonders, which you see here, Garden of the Gods, a park filled with really massive red rock formations. These areas are also home to several military installations, including Peterson Space Force Base, U.S. Air Force Academy, and U.S. Army's Fort Carson. About 45,000 military personnel, 15,000 federal workers, and 90,000 veterans reside in this region. And so you understand what we're talking about here. So here we have Peterson Space Force Base in yellow, Fort Carson in green, and the contamination areas are in white here. Stratmore, which is actually a neighborhood of southern Colorado Springs, and Security and Wide Field, which are official suburbs. So, although PFAS had early roots in World War II, which we talked about earlier in the making of the atom bomb, its military usage really took off in the 1960s. That was when the Navy worked with 3M to develop AFFF, which was a foam that suppressed jet fuel-based fires. By 1969, AFFF was present at more than 90 U.S. airports, and hundreds of military sites used the foam in emergencies and in training drills. And just like all those toxicological reports from the companies that I was mentioning before, military reports also show that the Department of Defense was looking into AFFF's toxicity for decades. I'll give you some examples, but there are many more. 1971, one report cited a threat to fish called AFFF a serious pollutant that didn't break down. A 1985 report that was conducted at Peterson labeled AFFF as hazardous. And more recently, in 2016, the Army Corps of Engineers found PFAS at Peterson Space Force Base in samples and cited potential non-carcinogenic risks to human health and the environment, as well as the migration of PFAS to downstream wells. Now, Fort Carson started listening to its own advice. This is the Army base. And it started using water for training in 1993 and replaced AFFF entirely in 2018. Peterson, although just up the road from Fort Carson, took much longer. And it's really almost impossible for me to get an answer as to why. I got some theories, and people just said the Air Force has more planes and jet fuel is very flammable at high temperatures. But it's not just the military. The FAA also required its firefighters to test and train AFFF, which at many airports, if they weren't like properly contained, ended up flowing into the environment until 2019. The Department of Defense did institute a military-wide ban on AFFF in training, and then after that pledged to cease all use of AFFF by 2024. From what I've heard, it largely has, if not 100%, but this went on for a long time. And as of 2021, the Air Force Civil Engineering Group actually launched PFAS removal pilot programs at Peterson Space Force Base. These were actually pretty cool. I was able to see the outside of some of them. Peterson has really invited local scientific laboratories to use this contaminated base as like a test case for their technologies and in terms of PFAS breakdown and removal. But one other thing worth noting is as of 2023, the Air Force had spent more than $103 million on PFAS response just at Peterson. Now, there are, I think the DoD says it's 539, if I'm correct, bases that are contaminated with PFAS. So think about that, how many tax dollars we are now currently spending on a problem of our own making. And these were some pictures I took at Peterson when I was there in May 2023. This charred plane that you see in the background here, that was an old plane that they would use for training. They would set it on fire, and then they would extinguish the fire, practice doing so with the AFFF, and then it would kind of just leach into the environment after. So I want you to meet Mark Favors, who grew up next to these bases during the Cold War era, part of a tightly knit Black family in largely white Colorado Springs. And as Mark tells it, the Cold War era patriotism really molded the city into a libertarian stronghold in which small government ideology reigned. And he said, quote, politics were highly, highly, highly discouraged. Military service, on the other hand, was almost compulsory in the community. So today, Mark is an ICU nurse in New York City, but he himself is a veteran, as are many of his relatives. So Mark estimates that more than 24 of his relatives have suffered from serious illnesses he attributes to PFAS releases from the bases, and at least 5 family members have suffered from kidney-related diseases. Now, I want to emphasize that these relatives are not necessarily related to each other. They are in-laws, step siblings, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not like necessarily a genetic connection. Now, Mark's acquaintance with PFAS only came as he sought out answers for the untimely death of his grandmother, Arletha Bragg, who had died a while before in 1991. You can see her in the bottom picture. Uh, she's the paternal grandmother, Mark's paternal grandmother, and also in the picture is Ivory Mitchell, who is his maternal aunt, and both of these two ended up getting sick. So again, paternal, maternal, both got sick. After Mark heard about PFAS on the news in 2018, fairly randomly, he then started digging a little bit himself, and he soon learned that levels of PFAS near Arletha's former house in Widefield, one of the suburbs, far exceeded EPA advisories. Mark's cousins, veteran Steve Patterson, as you see here, and his sister Princess, who's on a mural here because she died, spent their youth in the highly contaminated Stratmore Valley, which is actually in southern Colorado Springs. Princess had lupus-related kidney damage, then bladder cancer. Steve was actually able to give her a kidney, which he said it's pretty rare for siblings to be a match. But then the cancer returned to her liver, kidneys, spine, anus, and brain. Then she eventually died from these cancers. And Steve himself then developed prostate cancer and rectal cancer. He's currently in remission for both. But I just want you to hear just how he describes how this family is coping with this situation. Again, this is Steve, who is Mark Favors' cousin.
I think that if we was to stop and dwell on all this stuff, it'd probably even be worse. But what can we do? So if you see we're happy, we hang together, we laugh, we have fun, even though we just lost a brother, and just lost a cousin. But life goes on. I mean, we cry at the funeral, but sometimes we don't even cry because I don't think we have any more tears left because it's just been so many deaths. You know, it's just been too many.
So Mark has really taken his fight to the national level, and starting with a big opportunity in 2019 in November, when he was able to testify in a House hearing about his family's issues and the issues of his neighbors. And he, at the time, urged Congress to launch an investigation into the PFAS issue. He spoke alongside Mark Ruffalo, who portrayed Rob Bilot's fight against DuPont in West Virginia in the film Dark Waters, if you've ever seen that. And at the time as well, I'll emphasize that there was really bipartisan support, perhaps for different reasons, for the details that Mark was sharing. For example, Representative James Comer, a Republican from Kentucky, opposed what he's called sweeping actions that could cause economic harm, but he specifically said he supported compensating families, quote, poisoned intentionally by corporate America. So there really was, and from the other side of the aisle as well, there was support, and people seem to be coming together on the issue. The problem was that a couple months later, a global pandemic started and kind of derailed any progress. But Mark has since returned many times to testify before Congress on the PFAS issue, including just a couple months ago was the most recent time. And his goals remain to find out what really happened and hold people accountable if there was something nefarious, as the documents imply. Now, for Mark, one reason he wants to take this fight to Congress is because it's just so difficult to sue. It's really, you can't take this fight to court. That's because of the lack of legal recourse. And that's rooted in the statutes of limitations, which vary among states. Those are laws defining how much time people have to sue. For example, Colorado has a strict 2-year statute, but victims can wait to sue until finding a clear cause for injury. Alabamans, however, can only sue within 2 years of becoming ill. So what Alabaman is going to ever be able to have a personal injury case for PFAS? Now, there are some possible routes for litigation. So some of Mark's relatives have joined a massive multi-district litigation, which grouped thousands of claims versus AFFF producers before a federal judge in South Carolina. That is currently ongoing, but you should notice that those cases are versus AFFF producers. Suing the military, however, is virtually impossible due to the federal government's discretionary function immunity shield, which holds up except in very extreme scenarios. But for Mark, there isn't a sum of money that could make up for his family's losses. And how he puts it is, there's not enough money in the US Treasury for my grandmother. So Colorado itself, where that case was taking place, has actually managed to advance a considerable amount of PFAS-related legislation, which I won't get into right now. It's in the book. But there is a state with really far-reaching PFAS laws that I do want to highlight for a second. But that state was also responsible for much of its own PFAS problems. And that's just a few states north of you guys in Maine. So we're looking particularly at South Central Maine. Those dots are all the areas that were in the book, but we're looking at Arundel right now. And this is dairy farmer, really passionate dairy farmer, Fred Stone. His cows are members of his family, as you see from the decorations in his house. His license plate is Dairy O, and he's well versed in diseases of cattle from, I think that book is from like 1918, if I remember correctly. He's quite a character. Now, Fred's grandfather purchased his 18th century dairy farm from another family in 1914, right after World War I. And eventually it was passed down further, and Fred and his wife Laura bought it from his parents in 1977. But for Fred, there's a date of doom in his life, and that's November 3rd, 2016, when he received a letter from Kennebunk Water District saying that PFAS in his levels in his Wells aquifer were double the EPA's advisories at the time. This was very sudden for Fred, and he took it upon himself to test his cow's milk, realizing that the cows had drank that water. No one told him to do this. He voluntarily took this risk and came back with sky-high PFAS levels. This actually angered a lot of his neighbors because now he set precedent and other farmers needed to test as well. So his farm, called Stone Ridge, was immediately suspended from shipping milk. He and his wife installed a $23,000 filtration system in May 2017, and things actually started repairing themselves. Within about a year, the milk was clean and he was able to sell again. And then suddenly, the milk was testing for high PFAS levels again. What had happened? He had switched feeds, and it turns out that the feed was being grown on another farm that was contaminated by PFAS. And he had to just throw up his hands at that point and really almost give up. But he has some very interesting memories, and he recalled how before this point, before state officials actually became familiar with what PFAS was, an environmental inspector suggested to him that he exterminate his herd as if they carried some sort of infectious disease. And Fred, again, quite the character, had some interesting things to say about that.
And I said, fine, Tanya, I think it's a hell of an idea. I said, we'll go down to the compost site because we have a thing for, exterminating animals, and I said, and again, these cow families go way back to, 40, 50 years, and generations and generations in the lineage and what have you. So I said, I'll tell you what, Tanya, I said, I'll do that. We'll take them all down there. I'll put on my show whites, and I'll stand in front, and I'll take the first bullet, and then you can slaughter the rest of them. A week later, I get a letter from the state of Maine about suicide prevention.
He's not joking. This guy's a character.
And
Now, in June 2017, the Department of Environmental Protection in Maine identified the source of the contamination, and that source was from the 1983 to 2004 spread of something called sludge, which I'll explain what that is in a second. But who conducted the spreading? Well, it was none other than Fred Stone himself. At Maine's bidding, he had slathered his fields, and actually other fields as well, with what he had thought was nutritious fertilizer. And during yet another environmental inspection, Fred was equipped with, once again, choice words and decades-old documents. This one is from the 1980s. He'll speak about that in a second. This is a permit from the Environmental Protection Department telling him that he can do this sludge spread and guaranteeing that doing so will not pollute any water of the state of Maine. So here's what he had to say about that. Turning on the closed captions.
And because I am a complete a-hole, I walked over into my filing cabinet and pulled out a permit from '86, and it is on Department of Environmental Protection's masthead. It states that this material will not contaminate any waters of the state of Maine. This material will not present a health hazard. There's a whole laundry list that goes through. And on the back side, it is signed by the commissioner at the time of DEP. And just because I'm really go for gold, I also included the letter from Kennebunk Water stating that the water in the aquifers at 146 it was contaminated. And game, set, and match. I'm positive that the poor girl from DEP did not know that those documents existed. And because
Yeah, and this was the 2016 letter. He just has a whole filing cabinet filled with these things. But when asked about the sludge spread, a DEP spokesperson just said that the 1980s license was issued decades before DEP had standards in place for PFAS. So what is sludge? Those are the semi-solids left over after sewage treatment. And much of Maine's sludge comes from treatment lagoons on site at the state's many paper mills, some of which use PFAS in their pulping processes. Treatment, that secondary wastewater treatment, removes solids but not PFAS. Some of it stays in the water and some of it sticks to the solid waste. Now, utilities had peddled the sludge to farmers as a win-win. Utilities didn't have to pay landfilling costs and farmers got free fertilizer. And all of this was backed by the state of Maine because Maine has struggled with a shortage of dump space due to a ban on new private sites since 1989. Now, Fred Stone is now this accidental environmental activist. He'll still tell you he's not an activist. He's not an environmentalist. He's actually a staunch, this is how he describes himself, staunch anti-Trump Republican. And he actually ended up joining with local Democrat Henry Ingwerson to advance a lot of Maine's really big PFAS bills. So just a couple. There was an extension of the statute of limitations by adding a discovery clause. There was a national first, the first ban on PFAS products with intentionally added PFAS, elimination of PFAS-based firefighting foams, which now a lot of states have followed suit. Another first, and actually Maine remains one of the only, I think there's like maybe 2 or 3 at this point, a ban on PFAS-laden sludge application to farms. And in March 2024, a $60 million PFAS fund for buybacks of polluted farmland. Now, Fred helped create Maine's PFAS fund, but he himself is not too keen on the buyback due to his farm's historic nature. Like, he doesn't want it to go into somebody else's hands. And yet, at the same time, business is really rough. The Stones had to file for Chapter 12 bankruptcy on their house, and they get food stamps as well as subsidized health care. So they're currently exploring alternative uses of their land, and I think they have now secured a deal with a solar panel company that's going to put panels up on the contaminated land. But Fred maintains that there's not a whole lot of lead in our pencils. Now, we've had a look at how local communities and states have both created and coped with the threats posed by PFAS. But before concluding, I just want to take a broader look at how the federal government is faring and end with some potential solutions. So I'm just going to go back to Obama. We go a little farther back in the book, but in the Obama era, PFAS was not a priority at all. But some research did occur, and the EPA also updated a 1976 toxics law. Chemicals would now need to be proven innocent to enter the market rather than guilty to be removed. In 2012, the Obama EPA also found a new type of PFAS called Gen X in North Carolina's Cape Fear River via a DuPont facility, and residents were sick. I'm not sure why it says residents impacted. But in 2017 and 2018, blood samples of area residents didn't show Gen X. Instead, they showed 3 new types of PFAS. So we call this like the whack-a-mole of PFAS. And those types, so they found ultra short chain PFAS, which are those with 3 or fewer carbon atoms, as opposed to Gen X, which is short chain, or the legacy ones, which are known as long chain. And at the same time as this whack-a-mole with PFAS was really getting started, there was also a corporate whack-a-mole occurring, particularly at DuPont. It kept spinning off its PFAS business, changing hands as much as it could. And this time I do want to include DuPont's response. This is what a spokesperson had to say about DuPont's handling of PFAS. In 2019, DuPont de Nemours was established as a new multi-industrial specialty products company. DuPont de Nemours has never manufactured or sold PFOA, PFAS, Gen X, or firefighting foam. So you can take that for what it is. Moving to Trump 1.0, which we'll breeze through because we're already at Trump 2.0 at this point. But the Trump 1.0 EPA said it would assess the need for drinking water regulations, but didn't ever set them. One employee recalled writing a rule to deem PFOA and PFAS as hazardous, but it was like waiting for Godot because it just sat there. There were lingering loopholes that EPA approved new PFAS via a loophole that allows looser review for chemicals produced in small quantities, and created a second loophole that weakened toxic release reporting requirements. Career staffers actually told us that they tried to warn legislators about this shift, but they were blocked by Trump political hires. The Biden EPA actually ended up closing that second loophole in December 2023. Now, a pivotal moment arrived in April 2024, and that was when the EPA finally set the country's first federal drinking water standards for PFAS, for these 6 types of PFAS. And I'm sure most of you are acquainted with these numbers and the PPT, but in case anyone isn't, a part per trillion is equivalent to just a couple drops of water in about 20 Olympic-size pools. So we're talking about very small quantities here, and public systems would need to monitor for the 6 types of PFAS and fix all issues by 2029. Biden's EPA also designated PFOA and PFAS as hazardous under CERCLA and the Superfund cleanup law, making it easier to force polluters to clean up or pay for contamination. But the Trump 2.0 EPA had something different in mind. So May 2025, the EPA said it was rescinding and reconsidering limits on 4 of 6 PFAS from 2024. Only PFOA and PFAS would be maintained, but their compliance would be extended to 2031. So from 2029 to 2031, 2 more years to comply on those 2. In the fiscal year 2026, now this is very recent, National Defense Authorization Act, Congress recently proposed, again, it's not yet fully law, but proposed, delaying the AFFF phase out, allowing PFAS incineration, re-enabling Pentagon purchases of PFAS products, and cutting about $200 million in PFAS cleanup funds. The EPA also postponed a reporting deadline for companies that produced or imported PFAS from 2011 to 2022 by 9 months, giving them until, depending on their size, 2026 to 2027. And lastly, recent media reports have indicated that the EPA might repeal the hazardous substance designations for PFAS and PFOA. Again, I know as much as you do at this point. These are really all question marks, and we just have to wait and see what happens. So quickly moving to New Jersey, where you all are. New Jersey ranks among the most PFAS polluted states nationwide. The Garden State grapples with decades of PFAS exposure from industry and military sites such as Joint Base McGuire, Dix Lakehurst. And about approximately 6% of the 9.2 million New Jersey residents are drinking PFAS polluted water, according to an analysis conducted recently by the Philadelphia Inquirer. And just an example of one study, Rutgers conducted a study in Paulsboro showing that PFNA blood levels were 285% higher than US averages, and that was likely linked to Solvay specialty polymers. I did appreciate this graphic that the New Jersey DEP has, and that actually speaks to New Jersey's doing fairly well legislative and regulatory wise. So where New Jersey stands, in 2018, it was the first state to adopt regulatory standards for PFAS. 2019, it was the first state to order companies to address PFAS pollution. 2021, public systems had to start monitoring for PFOA and PFAS, and by December, private well owners did as well, which that is actually huge. That is very rare among states. 2024, public systems and landlords must provide notice of elevated PFAS levels in drinking water. Just a month ago, actually, there was a $2 billion settlement with DuPont, Chemours, and Corteva with an $875 million payout and up to $1.2 billion in cleanup costs. And those are related to these 4 sites: Pompton Lakes Works, Rapauno Works, Chambers Works, and DuPont Parlin. And next year, there will be taking effect a ban on PFAS-based firefighting foams. So I'm probably running short on time because we have some Q&A. But I do want to emphasize that there are methods for removing PFAS from drinking water, and utilities across the country are adopting those. And there are also, a lot of these are also available at household scale. So those main technologies include granular activated carbon, in which a sponge basically traps the PFAS. Reverse osmosis, that's like what Brenda Hampton's community had. This one consumes a lot of water though, so it is only good in certain places. And then I won't get into the details, but the one I saw in Colorado, which consumes far less water, and in the West, the US West, you have to prioritize, conservation of water in addition to cleaning up water. That's ion exchange, and the facility looks like this. Now, while these technologies remove PFAS, they don't destroy them. Instead, the chemicals actually become someone else's forever problem. Unless there's a magical solution? Well, not exactly, but scientists, as you probably all know, around the world are innovating techniques for degrading PFAS, and some of their methods are close to market ready. Essentially, they are breaking the unbreakable. And 3 of the main categories, I'm not going to get into detail about them, but are electrochemical oxidation, low temperature plasma treatment, and sonolysis. And one that I would like to highlight is a tool that's already operating at scale, at pilot commercial scale, and that's called the PFAS Annihilator, which has been developed by Revive Environmental at the Battelle Memorial Institute, which is a nonprofit company. In their annihilator, the reaction occurs in supercritical water, so neither liquid nor gas, but it has the properties of both, and under really high temperature and pressure. So gases that don't dissolve in water now can, creating a super solvent fluid that is both expandable and compressible, and reactions are able to occur with fewer limits. This allows oxidants to catalyze the breakdown of the very formidable carbon-fluorine bond. And what's left is PFAS-free water, carbon dioxide, and inert salts. And if the filtered PFAS arise in concentrate, say from a granular activated carbon filtration site, like if they filter out the PFAS and send it there in concentrate, the reactor, which fits in a 20-foot shipping container, can treat the equivalent of 500,000 gallons of raw sewage daily. And Revive currently has several PFAS annihilators up and running, as do several other startup companies have similar technologies set up. But when addressing that formidable carbon-fluorine bond, I'd like to end on this quote from the CEO of Revive Environmental. He says, "This is like The Rock and John Cena holding hands, and you're trying to break that." So thank you for listening. That's Poisoning the Well. My email is there, and my co-author's email is there as well, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Thanks a lot, Sharon. That was a very engaging presentation. Like